Hello, class. I'm back. This is lecture 24 for History 102. And we just elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt President of the United States. So he'll be sworn in March of 1933. And that'll be the last time Inauguration Day is held in March. As we'll find out in 37, they're going to move it to January 20th like we have today. So when FDR takes over, unemployment's 25%. The majority of the nation's banks have closed, and some states don't even have any operating banks, and things are just horrendous. And a lot of it has to do with the inactivity of President Hoover. So, in his famous inaugural day speech, he basically makes some of the famous phrases that, all we have to fear is fear itself, a phrase you've obviously heard before. And he also says, summing up the speech, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And this is when he unveils his solution to the Great Depression, the New Deal. Now, obviously, he's taken a tip from his famous cousin Theodore. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt had the Square Deal. And there are 3 R's to the New Deal, just like there were 3 C's to the Square Deal. The 3 R's are relief, recovery, and reform. Providing immediate relief to the starving millions, helping our economy recover from this horrible depression, and then enacting reforms to make sure that it never, ever happens again. That's the New Deal. So what I want you to do is open your books to page 747. We have a very important chart there that we're going to be following, and this is key. You need to be looking at this. Once again, it's on page 747, and it's table 31.1, Principal New Deal Acts during the 100 Days Congress. Now, FDR is going to jump right into action, and during his first 100 days in the White House, which is commonly known in political circles for a brand new president as the honeymoon period, where typically in non-crisis times, Congress will cooperate with the new president and pass legislation to allow him to have some of his promises he made on the campaign trail enacted. So there's sort of this climate of cooperation that happens during the first 100 days or honeymoon period. And then after that, obviously, it's typically all bets off. Now, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal Congress, which will be Democrat majorities in both houses elected in with him in 1932, will enact an outrageous volume of really important legislation in just a 100-day period. And it's sort of the standard that people look to as to what's going to happen in a president's first 100 days. No president has even come close to all these important pieces of legislation that are pushed through in FDR's first 100 days. It's amazing, as you'll see. So let's take a look at this. And the first thing that we want to talk about, if you look at the chart, Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 5th. The very next day, he makes an announcement that he's closing all banks that are still open temporarily so they can do something to repair the ailing banking system. Now, he'll go to a special session of Congress that day and tell them that they have to act immediately to do something to save what's left of the banking industry. Because over 5,000 banks have closed. It's teetering on collapse. So, what will happen here, is tip my coffee over, they will, as you can see, they'll pass just 3 days later, if you look at the chart, on March 9th, 1933, the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Now, what this does is sets up this system where a whole army of bank inspectors are going to fan out across the country as soon as this is passed on March 9th. And they'll go and look at the books of the banks that are still in existence. And they're going to categorize them into 3 different categories. Some banks, when they look at them, are still relatively healthy. They're strong. Obviously, when they get to reopening the banks, as we'll see will happen on March 13th, a week later, those banks will open. They weren't in trouble of falling apart and closing anyway, so obviously they're going to reopen. There are some other banks that are in trouble, but the bank inspectors believe with loans from the government and proper management, they'll be fine. So that group of banks are going to reopen on the 13th also. Unfortunately, there are some banks, after the bank inspectors look at them, that are beyond repair. They were teetering on collapse on March 6th. There's no helping them because the government doesn't really have any money. They're going to have to come up with money. So those banks, unfortunately, are never going to reopen. So what's going to happen here, on Sunday, March 12th, FDR is going to make the very first of what will become a tradition with him while he's in the White House. He's going to make his first so-called fireside chat, where he sits in the Oval Office next to the fireplace and talks to the American public on the radio, because that's the main way of communication, no television. And that evening, FDR tries to calm everybody's fears. He tells them, okay, the banks have been closed since the 6th. They're going to reopen. And he explains to them what's going to happen. And he guarantees them that the banks that reopen the next day on the 13th will stay open forever. So he's pleading with the American public, please do not go down and take all your money out of the bank or have a run on the bank or a panic, as it was known in the old days. So, tries to calm everybody's nerves, tells them exactly what's going to happen. So the very next day, the banks open. The Roosevelt administration's very nervous. You know, critics are saying they aren't going to listen to you. They're all going to run down and get their money out of the banks. They think that they're all going to close and whatnot. So they're sitting there and they're getting data sent to them as to what's happening. It's the end of business on the 13th, and the bank inspectors report in from all over the country. And lo and behold, more money was put in to the banks that reopened than was withdrawn. Something that Roosevelt never thought would happen. And this just shows how successful leveling with the people over the radio really was. They believed him, but they're desperate. They need some sort of leadership, and he's the man. So you can see that's the banking. We start out the first 100 days fixing the banks, the biggest problem. Next, you can see on your list the Beer Act. The Beer and Wine Revenue Act is passed on March 22nd, 1933. And basically what that does is it puts an extremely high tax on beer and wine, which are immediately starting to be sold, even though prohibition still exists. So technically speaking, this was quasi-legal. But no one's going to argue with it because this is going to bring in really badly needed revenue to the government so they can start doing things. Then, at the same time, the 21st Amendment will be passed by Congress. In fact, they'll use a special speedy ratification process by having ratifying conventions in all the states instead of the state legislatures. And very rapidly, the 21st Amendment will make the 18th Amendment, which created prohibition, null and void. I like to refer to the 21st Amendment as the oops, we goofed amendment, because all it does is cancel out a previous amendment. We've never had anything like that before, and hopefully never again. So, beer and wine are being sold, then pretty rapidly all alcoholic beverages will be sold legally again, and revenue will pour into the government. Now, the next one you can see there is the CCC, which stands for the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was created, as you'll notice on that chart, by the Unemployment Relief Act passed in March 31st, 1933. Many people consider the CCC the most useful and successful program created during the New Deal. Here's what it's all about. Now, one major big-time problem was unemployment among young men in cities. Now, we know that the national unemployment rate was 25%. The unemployment rate of young men between 18 and 25 in major cities, in some cases, was 70-some% because they were unskilled and they couldn't find jobs. You had former white-collar, middle-class fathers willing to do anything to feed their families, taking on jobs that were, that the unskilled laborers would in the past. So these young men, having no hope of finding a job with a bunch of time on their hands in a city, are going to do you know what? Probably get in trouble. So this program is designed for them. It's going to take them out of the cities. It creates these conservation corps that will go to our national parks, improve them, build new buildings, build new roads in the national parks. They'll go into national forests, fight forest fires, replant trees. They'll go into state forests like the Adirondack Park, blaze new trails. I don't know if any of you have ever hiked a trail in the Adirondacks that at the trailhead has a marker saying this trail was blazed by the CCC in 1935 or whatever. They're going to do all these great things all across the country to improve our national park system, our national forests, our state forests, and it's a thing of beauty because it takes these young men out of the cities. They get paid a wage. They also have all their room and board and clothing provided to them. They'll live in like dormitory settings and whatnot. Their work clothes are provided to them. So is all their food. So typically these young guys, come payday, they're out in the middle of nowhere. They have nowhere to spend their money. They send their earnings back to their parents who are living in the cities, and that allows their parents to help feed their younger brothers and sisters. This was a brilliant program. So, but like everything else, you'll find out there's critics. Some people are arguing, why in the world are we spending all this money, excuse me, on our national parks? No one can afford to go there. FDR counters, when this is all said and done, we're going to have the most beautiful national park system in the world, and people will flock to them. Was he right? So, the next thing that you can see on your chart here, FDR fools around with the gold standard. We're not going to talk about that. He'll end up abandoning the gold standard for monetary reasons. You'll learn about that someday in an economics class if you ever take economics. I'm not going to try to explain to you what that means. But the next one here is important, and that's the government agency known as FERA. And FERA is created by the Federal Emergency Relief Act and creates that administration. Now, what FERA is going to do is FERA, excuse me for a second, I got to find my notes. FERA is going to give federal emergency relief to the tune of $3 billion, more than what Hoover spent on his public works project, to the states themselves. So this is to provide immediate relief. The money's distributed to the states to help feed, house, and clothe the starving masses. And the person who is behind this, and it was partially his idea, is a guy who becomes a top administrator and advisor to FDR, and that's a man that we'll talk about quite often during FDR's stay in the White House. That's Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins, at one point in his career, was a social worker in New York City. He had become the head of the social services program in New York State under Governor Roosevelt, and Roosevelt brought him to Washington with him, and he will be in charge initially of FERA to distribute all these funds to the states. He will gain the confidence of FDR, and by the end of FDR's reign in the White House in 1945, Hopkins will be his most trusted advisor. He'll send him off to Europe to meet with the likes of Winston Churchill and others during World War II as his ambassador. So, but Hopkins is going to be in charge of FERA in the beginning, and it's a very effective way to get relief to the starving masses. Now, the next one you'll notice there is the AAA, and it's not the Automobile Club, it's the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, remember, there was big problems with the crops rotting in the fields. To take care of this, what the AAA does is it's literally going to pay some farmers not to farm, because they study this and figure out, okay, at this point, the country can consume so many millions of bushels of wheat, corn, and whatnot. And they come up with these production limits. And the whole thing is, they needed to get the price of these products to rise. And you do it through supply and demand. So because of this, you had to have some farmers not producing anything to meet these lower limits and get the prices to rise. So as a result, some farmers will be randomly selected, and they'll be paid as if they had a cash crop in the ground. The next year, they'd pick somebody else, and these farmers would farm again. Now, to give you an idea of how successful this program was, when it was instituted in 1933, the total income of all farmers in America was $2 billion. Thanks to the AAA, 3 years later, in 1935, the total income of farmers in America was $5 billion. A very successful program, but unfortunately, in 1936, the Supreme Court will rule it unconstitutional. As we'll find out, the Supreme Court is a conservative old court appointed by Harding and Coolidge that's living in the past. And they're going to rule a lot of New Deal programs unconstitutional. And we'll talk about how FDR attempts to deal with that problem later on. Okay, the next big program here is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is another thing of beauty. It's going to target an area that a lot of people thought would never be helped ever, and that's Appalachia. People living in extreme poverty in the Appalachian Mountains, and they had been like that before the Great Depression. Many of them had nothing. So, one big problem that they typically suffered through every spring was floods on the Tennessee River system. So what this program's going to do, it's going to build a series of dams on the Tennessee River and its tributaries in the middle of the Appalachians. And these dams are going to serve multiple purposes. Immediately, the construction of these dams will provide very good paying jobs to the people of Appalachia. Now, once the dams are completed, all of them are going to be hydroelectric dams. So they're going to produce very inexpensive electricity. And it will bring electricity to the Appalachia for the first time ever. Not only will this bring electricity to people's homes, it'll provide very inexpensive electricity that will lure in industry to locate there. And it's very inexpensive because all the upfront costs are covered by the government, and then these dams are turned over to electric companies. But they have to provide the electricity at extremely low prices. Now, another benefit of these dams, now you can control flooding by controlling the flow of these rivers. So it eliminates flooding. Then the other great part of it, besides providing long-term jobs with the industry that it attracts, behind every dam is a reservoir. These become beautiful mountain lakes, and they become tourist destinations later. Little camps and hotels pop up all around them. They become fishing and boating paradises, all as a result of the TVA. So this will bring economic prosperity to the Appalachia for the first time ever. So the next thing there you can see right underneath in reform is the Federal Securities Act. That will, for the first time ever, start regulating the stock market, which was completely unregulated, which is part of the reason why it crashed so severely. And it creates the Security Exchange Commission, ultimately, the SEC, which still operates today and regulates all markets. As you can see, FDR once again fools around with gold. The next one's also a very important one. The Homeowners Refinance Act, which creates the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. This is going to allow 1 million people, 1 million families that have not lost their homes yet to foreclosure to be able to keep their homes, because they may be on the brink of not being able to make their mortgage payments, but now they can have the government refinance their loans, lower the mortgage price, their payments to levels that they can afford to keep paying and thus remain in their homes. It works for 1 million families. Otherwise, they'd have been in Hoovervilles too. So this was an extremely important program. Plus, the last thing America needed was 1 million more homes to be foreclosed on. We already had millions of homes sitting vacant, and the banks had gone out of business that held the notes on them. Now, the next one you can see is the National Industrial Recovery Act, which creates the National Recovery Administration, and it also creates the Public Works Administration. Now, what this particular act does is it's going to regulate what's left of the labor market. It's going to stabilize production, and it's also going to create a minimum wage for the first time ever. And it's going to create a system where workers can only work a maximum amount of hours. The government doesn't want any companies, once they start to recover, to have workers working overtime. They'd much rather have them hire another person and put another person to work. So that is taken care of by the one part of it, the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NRA as it becomes known. Then the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, will create the first of many public works projects, and it'll immediately create a bunch of government projects to be built, especially in Washington, D.C., the building of buildings and whatnot at government expense to put people to work. Then to wrap this up, this amazing first 100 days, GlassSteagall banking reform will be created. So they'll start the 100 days with banking reform, they'll end it. And the main part of GlassSteagall is it creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC that we take for granted today. That's the institution today that guarantees your bank account up to $250,000 if the bank were to close or go out of business. This insurance program insures your money. So no longer do you have to worry about if a bank closes, you lose all your life savings. So that's the amazing 100 days of FDR's New Deal. That's where we'll call it quits for today. I'll be back in a few days to talk about the rest of the New Deal and FDR's administration. So I'm going to be signing off. I'm, obviously not today working on grading all your quizzes, but I'm working on them, but I've got a boatload of them, and I've got assignments from my other 3 classes too. So be patient. I'll get them graded, but not in rapid fashion like I normally do. So everybody be safe, stay home. See you next time.